So I'm happy you showed up. I would like to talk about the politics of international redistribution today. And the talk is sort of loosely based on a paper that I wrote together with my co-author, which came out earlier this year. I don't know whether you received it. But yeah, so the idea is that I tell you a little bit about why we became interested in the topic, about what international redistribution is in the first place, before delving into what we think might explain support for international redistribution. And I would like to weave in, since this is a lecture, a more general story about preferences for redistribution, and a story about the future of left-right politics. But you could also talk about that in the Q&A. So how did we become interested in the topic? Well, in sort of late 2009, following sort of the peak of the global economic crisis, the crisis in Europe entered a new phase, which became known as the sort of Eurozone crisis. And essentially what happened was that investors lost faith in the European economies, specifically the peripheral European economies, and that led to a drastic rise in interest rates and therefore in the cost of borrowing. And that in turn put a number of countries, including Greece, at the brink of defaulting on their debt. So in response to that crisis, the Eurozone finance ministers in 2011 came together and patched up the European Stability Mechanism, which is essentially a financial assistance program that gives out cheap loans to these countries that can no longer borrow on private markets. And it's financed by the contributions of all the Eurozone member states and has an authorized capital of about 700 billion euros. And so some have actually called the European Stability Mechanism the biggest transfer program since the end of the Second World War, which is a little bit of a misnomer because countries actually have to repay these loans. This money is not for free. But what the European Stability Mechanism did, it kind of made the cost of European integration, specifically economic integration, a lot more visible to voters, much more than sort of any other program before then. And so it led to this quite intense public backlash against the European Union. And we sometimes tend to forget how intense that backlash was, so I put some media coverage around the Great Bailout. So this is covers of German newspapers and magazines. And so here, this is a pretty bad German tabloid that says Merkel is saving Greece with our money. Then you have here on the right, you have traders in the Euro family. Greece is wasting our money. Here you have a slightly racist picture of a Greek and a German guy dancing, and the Germans sort of holding on to the Euro bills. And on the other hand, there was this great media coverage likening Merkel to Hitler. And the same here at a protest in Athens in October 2012. And all this is to say that the situation was actually quite tense, more so than perhaps we remember today. And it was sort of the first time that you had this big public backlash against the European Union. The European Union was in the headlines of all the national newspapers. And it was sort of the top topic in national politics. And the European public kind of became involved to an extent that it hadn't done before. And now that today, perhaps it isn't used to new, with all the sort of headlines about populism in the European Union. But I'd venture to say that it was the first big public backlash against European economic integration. And that is, although the stability mechanism fell short of a more comprehensive transfer union that many economists had called for, including Paul Krugman in 2011. And that transfer union would have addressed actually some of the biggest challenges of the common currency zone, one of which is the loss of monetary autonomy. So not having monetary autonomy actually means that none of these countries in the economic crisis was able to cut their interest rates like the Fed is currently doing in the United States to fight the recession, because they had given up that authority. And in the absence of this monetary authority, actually, scholars believe that fiscal integration, or this fiscal transfer union, is a precondition for a working common currency zone. And so fiscal integration essentially is a risk-sharing mechanism that would distribute money to countries with economic difficulties in this currency zone, put very simply. And that sort of exists in the United States, which is often compared to the European Union in terms of being a common currency zone, but it does not exist in Europe. And that made the sort of burden of adjusting to the economic crisis a lot harsher than it had to be. But, calls for this transfer union very quickly dropped, seeing that already the stability mechanism faced such a fierce public backlash. And I just wanted to show you some descriptive data on what public opinion on this transfer union actually looked like at the time. So this is data from the European Election Study 2014, which surveyed about 1,000 respondents in each of the 28 member states, and asked the question, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? In times of crisis, it is desirable to give financial help to another EU member state facing severe economic and financial difficulties. And the answer categories here ranging from totally disagree to totally agree. And you can see sort of at 2.5 here is about a neutral score, that in a lot of the European countries, the majority of the population did not support fiscal transfers. So they tend to be on the disagree to totally disagree side. And we think that these figures might actually overestimate real support, because from research on foreign aid, we know that there's such a thing called immediacy bias, that is, people are more likely to support transfers in the context of an acute crisis. And so, going back to that question, it actually asks in times of crisis, doesn't ask for a more institutionalized mechanism. So, in other words, the actual figures of support for an institutionalized mechanism might be even lower than that. And so we matched that with countries' gross national income per capita, and you can see that there's somewhat of a very loose connection, in the sense that countries with a higher GNI per capita tend to exhibit greater support for these transfer programs than countries with a lower GNI per capita. And that is a little bit counterintuitive, because you would think that poorer countries actually tend to be among the beneficiaries of such a transfer program. But we can talk about that in a Q&A, and I can get back to it later on. So, given that sort of public backlash, we wanted to explain what the factors could be that could drive these preferences towards EU transfers or international redistribution more generally. And specifically, we wondered whether support for this international redistribution is structured in a similar way to support for domestic redistribution. So, in other words, we wondered whether there's a connection between domestic solidarity and international solidarity. Why? Because we thought, okay, maybe the values that underpin support for domestic redistribution, like a belief in equality and fairness, might be the same values driving support for these fiscal transfers. And that is important because support for domestic redistribution is believed to underpin the political party system, or at least it used to, and we can discuss the extent to which that is still the case. But support for economic redistribution within a country used to be associated with the economic left, or the support for left-wing parties, whereas opposition to domestic redistribution was associated with support for right-wing parties. And so if it is the case that domestic solidarity and international solidarity are the same thing, then this whole conflict over EU transfers should map on that dimension of political contestation. Does support for domestic redistribution actually translate into support for international redistribution? Well, the short answer is no, not really, or at least not directly. So let me show you some data again from the European election study 2014. You can see that those individuals who support domestic redistribution are actually less likely to support EU transfers. So in other words, your typically left-leaning crowd here is less likely to support EU fiscal transfers than the right-leaning crowd. So if support for domestic redistribution is not driving this, then what is? So what might explain support for these transfers? Well, recent research says that it might be cultural openness or cosmopolitanism, if you will. And the reason for this is that culturally open or cosmopolitan voters have this more encompassing sort of definition of political community and a more encompassing identity, and therefore might be more willing to give money to other countries than culturally closed voters who conceive of their political community more as a narrow national community and have an exclusive national identity. And if that is the case, and these cultural preferences explain support for EU transfers, then this whole conflict should map on the sort of cultural dimension. Being here at Chapel Hill, you might be familiar with this dimension already. It's a dimension that pitches the green, alternative, and libertarian parties on the one hand against traditional authoritarian nationalistic parties. It's sometimes called the Galatan dimension as well. And so we should see this conflict play out on this dimension rather than the left-right. And to some extent, this is what happened. So 10 parties across European countries picked up on this anti-Euro, anti-Eurozone sentiment, and actually it led to the creation of a new party in Germany, a new 10 party called Alternative for Germany. And this is one of their first campaign ads saying, Euro is ruining Europe and us. So quite a strong anti-Eurozone stance, and here you have the sinking Euro as well. And today you have some Salvini picking much up on the same sentiment with his sort of Basta Euro t-shirt. And here you have kind of a reunion of sort of 10 party leaders across Europe discussing the future of Europe. But we thought that was kind of puzzling. So is it really that support for domestic redistribution does not matter at all in this story? That would be surprising because after all, these transfers tap into some pretty basic notions of solidarity, of cross-European solidarity. So we wanted to understand why support for domestic redistribution does not translate into support for international redistribution. And in order to do that, we wanted to sort of decompose what support for domestic redistribution means. So this was the main puzzle. So let me explain a little bit what we mean by support for domestic redistribution and tell you a little bit about the literature before explaining our theory. Well, this literature on support for domestic redistribution is extremely wide and very advanced. But broadly speaking, there are two main camps. So one group of scholars believes that support for domestic redistribution is really a function of a person's values and beliefs about such things as fairness, equality, distributive justice, the appropriate role of government, etc. And these scholars find that these values and beliefs influence a person's stance on redistribution regardless of that person's income, of that person's occupation, or social class. And it turns out that these preferences are actually quite consistent over time, so very few individuals change these values across the life course. And so if we expect these underlying values to generate some sort of coherent pattern across sort of the domestic realm and the international realm, you would kind of expect support of domestic redistribution to translate into support for international redistribution, including EU transfers. Okay, but then there's sort of another group of scholars that says, no, it's not really about an individual's beliefs and values, it's about economic self-interest. So they find that, a person's support for domestic redistribution is a function of how it will affect their material well-being. There's sort of a person's income and sort of risk exposure, so risk of future job loss, for example, being sort of the main predictors. So in a nutshell, these scholars are saying that individuals with an income below the national mean support redistribution because on average they benefit from it, and individuals with an income above that mean will not support it or actually oppose it because they do not benefit. So if we think that support for domestic redistribution is actually a function of this economic self-interest, it's not quite clear why it should translate into support for international redistribution. So if we take that group of low-income, potentially low-skill, high-risk workers, why should they be thrilled about sort of EU fiscal transfers or international redistribution in general? In fact, they might actually sort of fear that international redistribution reduces the resources available for domestic redistribution, so the resources available for them, and sort of perceive some sort of a resource conflict between domestic and international redistribution. Or if not a resource conflict, at least sort of a trade-off. So what we're arguing is, if we think that support for domestic redistribution is not either or, but a mixture of these values and economic self-interest, then it becomes complicated, right? Because then support for domestic redistribution is essentially double-edged. It expresses a set of values about fairness and equality, and it expresses self-interest, or economic self-interest. And it's ultimately that double-edged nature that makes it very difficult to discern when they translate into support for international redistribution and when they don't. So we wanted to parse out these two dimensions in order to understand when does the support travel and when it doesn't travel. So our theoretical model is actually pretty straightforward. We hypothesized that high-income voters don't necessarily perceive their material well-being at risk from international redistribution. So they can, in a sense, afford to extend their values about equality and fairness to the international level. That might not be the case for low-income workers, right? So they might fear that their well-being is put at risk by international redistribution because resources are taken away and they perceive this conflict. And so although they share the values about equality and fairness, they might not translate it to the international level. So let me just sum this up. The idea is that where self-interest and values are in conflict, as amongst the low-income voters, the material self-interest prevails, whereas when they're not in conflict, values prevail. So I put this in a nice table to make it clearer. So we do think that it's among the high-income voters that support for domestic redistribution actually translates into support for international redistribution, so for EU transfers. But among low-income voters, we actually hypothesize the exact opposite. We think that support for domestic redistribution might lead to opposition for international redistribution. And down here we have those people who do not believe in redistribution to begin with, who do not really share the values about equality and fairness, and there's no reason to believe that they, for some reason, should then support international redistribution either. So let me show you some data again from the same European election study. And so here you just see those individuals who support domestic redistribution. So you're typically left-leaning crowd. And so the first graph is splitting up this group by social class. So low income, middle income, and high income class. And you see that down here, it's the left-leaning voters in the high income class that actually support transfers, so slightly more supportive. And those in the low-income class actually are more opposed to EU transfers. So your left-leaning high-income voters tend to support it. Your left-leaning low-income voters tend to be opposed to EU transfers. And we did the same thing with different occupational groups, and you can see that those in the middle management and those who are self-employed professionals who are left-leaning support EU transfers. But those who are unskilled labor or unemployed actually oppose it. So there's a pretty interesting difference. So I want to jump into some results of our analysis in which we actually included sort of a bunch of individual level variables and country level variables. I haven't talked a lot about the country level, but I'd be happy to do so later. And just, I want to mention that at the very beginning, obviously we find that cultural orientations and identity matter as well. So we're not saying that previous research is wrong in that regard. So those who have an exclusive national identity as opposed to a European identity actually oppose these transfers, and those who are culturally closed as opposed to culturally open also oppose these transfers. But interestingly, even if we control for that, the support for domestic redistribution still matters. And I'm going to show you how it matters. So this is a graph with the predicted probabilities based on that analysis. And on the x-axis here you have support for domestic redistribution, 0 being sort of completely against domestic redistribution, 10 being completely for domestic redistribution. So typically right and left voters. And on the y-axis you have support for EU transfers. Now the dashed line shows the high-income voters, and the straight line shows the low-income voters. Now among the high-income voters, you can see as they become more supportive of domestic redistribution, they support EU transfers. And actually the group in this whole sample that is most supportive of EU transfers is high-income, left-leaning voters. Among the low-income class, you have the exact opposite trend. So as they become more supportive of domestic redistribution, their support for EU transfers decreases. And actually, the group in the sample the least likely to support any sort of transfer mechanism in the EU is the left-leaning, low-income crowd. And actually, if you look, they're even less likely to support these transfers than right-leaning, low-income voters. And that's a bit of a puzzling finding. So the gap is quite large. So let me just show you two other sort of variables that we use in order to try and get at people's material well-being. So we used the question about financial troubles, which essentially asks if you experience any financial troubles within the last 12 months. And the answer categories were most of the time, from time to time, or almost never. So among those who never really experienced financial troubles, support for domestic redistribution is sort of leads to more support for EU transfers. Among those who did experience financial troubles, it's the exact opposite. It actually leads to opposition for EU transfers. And the same for sort of these occupational categories. Among the unemployed and the unskilled, those who support domestic redistribution actually oppose EU transfers. And among the middle management and self-employed, they support EU transfers. So this is sort of the general finding. Coming back to this country-level variation that I mentioned earlier, we do find in the same analysis that it is actually the poorer countries, so the ones with the lower GNI per capita, that are more opposed to these transfer schemes. And that is we spent some time trying to think about why that might be the case, but it could be that really they don't think it's their job to contribute to a financial mechanism. It should be the richer countries doing it. And that sort of combined with the fact that, many of the sort of European Stability Mechanism prescribed policies were quite contested in these countries. So they were not really thrilled about the intervention of the European Union in their countries. And interestingly, that effect that I just showed you becomes even more intense in poorer countries. So actually the spread becomes even wider, and those who are pro-domestic redistribution, the low-income class in the poorer countries, are really the most opposed to these transfer mechanisms. Whereas those in the high-income class who are pro-domestic redistribution in the richer countries, like Sweden, but also Germany, are very pro-transfers. So I just want to wrap this up by saying what are the implications of these findings, and what do we do with that knowledge? And we thought that it actually has some implications for mainstream political parties, specifically for mainstream left-wing parties. So here you have a couple of traditional social democratic parties in Europe. And we think that it's kind of the multi-dimensionality of this support for domestic redistribution that makes it very difficult for these parties to position themselves on things like EU transfers or international redistribution more generally. So if they support these schemes, they might win the support of their high-income left-leaning voters, but at the same time they might lose the support of their low-income left-wing voters. So they're more traditional working-class clientele. And if we're actually correct about this, it might be the case that other policy areas are structured in a similar way, so that the attitudes also for things like international trade, European integration, foreign aid, and even immigration are driven in a similar way. And that makes it very difficult for these sort of mainstream left-wing parties to position themselves on these issues, because they're always trying to sort of address both their high-income and their low-income voters. And actually, I'm going to leave it at that so that you can ask any question that comes to mind.